Excited to have a special guest here. This is Dr. Bruce Campbell, and he's recently retired within the last year, working in the world of ear, nose, and throat surgery, and also has a very strong interest in narrative medicine and continues to be helping the medical community, an author of a book that's come out within the last year, as well as working with medical students. And also, I found him through the American College of Physicians, who's going to host in a couple of weeks from the time of this recording. Already will have happened by the time this gets on air for the podcast, but talking about narrative medicine. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you, Dr. Lenz. Appreciate it.
So tell us a little bit about your background as a physician or
Sure.
whatever backstory you want to share to make talking about narrative medicine.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. So I grew up in the Chicago area, so not too far away, but just far enough away since my family lived there and we lived in Milwaukee. It was great when our kids were little because Grandma and Grandpa were real far away, but they didn't drop in unexpectedly very often. So that was a nice distance for us. I went to Purdue University undergrad and then back to Chicago Rush for medical school and came to MCW for my otolaryngology or ENT residency. And then I went to MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston for a 2-year head and neck surgery fellowship and decided Milwaukee was great. We loved it here. So my wife and I moved back in 1987 and was on the faculty at the medical school, actually still on the faculty. But my clinical practice revolved around patients with cancer, primarily actually benign and malignant diseases of the head and neck. I didn't do sinuses or dizziness or ears and things like that. I ended up doing mostly cancer and tumors, oral cavity and salivary glands, thyroid, things like that. And I worked both at the VA and at Frederick, a little bit of children's, not very much. Retired from my clinical practice completely last summer. So now my work is primarily with the medical students. I do work with writing and reflective writing, helping them prepare their personal statements for residency application. I work with the Current Institute. I've been editing a newsletter for a couple of years and also editing a couple of books for them since I have an interest in writing, which I guess we'll be talking about. And just living the dream, still enjoying being around. Now we got our own grandkids and we're enjoying living in the States still.
Well, awesome. And it sounds like you were part of an academic medicine and in some sense being always connected with training, residency, and working with the Medical College of Wisconsin and Frederick Medical, and assuming VA is part of that, always been in part of wanting to be connecting and helping the next generation.
Yeah, I enjoyed doing clinical research. I had a grant at one point to look at issues that our cancer survivors were facing, long-term cancer survivors, because I was, there was this sort of thing that you follow someone for 5 years and they're cancer-free and then you tell them they're fine, goodbye. A lot of them still had terrible problems after 5 years, and actually the problems tended to get worse. So that was the focus of my work, was to try and learn as much as we could about people who were more than 5 years out from their cancer treatment, because I thought they were a group of patients who just didn't have a voice in medicine, and there wasn't any research money really to look at that group. But we did a couple of projects, and that was an interesting niche to work in for a while as well.
Yeah. So we're talking about narrative medicine, and it's something that you probably never were taught when you were in medical school or residency. And we haven't, although it's interesting as I'm doing research for the topic neurasthenia, going back to the 1800s and early 1900s, it was doctors spending a lot of time to get the chance to hear patient stories. So in one sense, it's probably for a while wasn't maybe regularly incorporated, but in the history of medicine was a relatively big part of it, but wasn't formally can be called narrative medicine.
So narrative medicine is actually two different things. So there is actually a very narrowly defined field of narrative medicine. There's a department of narrative medicine and ethics at Columbia University where a lot of the work has grown from. So Rita Sharon is the chair of that department. She and a group of friends back in the 90s developed some projects where they were focused on how to help medical students particularly understand that patients are, part of a story. I mean, someone who comes in and we, in medicine, you tend to refer to the gallbladder in room 6 or the trauma down in the ED. And it's actually, it's a human being who happens to be interfacing with a medical system. And how do you get students so they reflexively want to know about the person's story rather than just about, what piece is broken today? And also to understand that, particularly with chronic illness, how each little individual episode is just a tiny piece of the patient's life, But for the physician, or particularly for medical students, that is all that they focus on. So it really is a whole field where at Columbia, the goal is to use creative work, paintings and music and fiction and short stories and poetry. And you get people working in a group to discuss a particular piece of creative work and then write in the shadow of that in a way that allows them to explore a topic in a way that lets them understand that the creative work and the reflective pieces are within us all the time. We just need to find ways to coax them out. And I think that's what a lot of narrative medicine is. Columbia University Associated Narrative Medicine, I do a lot of that kind of reflective and writing in the shadow of a creative work with students and residents on my own. But there's sort of this larger picture where understanding stories is critical. And particularly I know that your work is in chronic illness, but that is absolutely a perfect example. I'm on the editorial board of a medical journal called Intima, which is a narrative medicine journal. And we get so many submissions from people who have chronic pain or chronic illness or have taken care of someone who has had chronic illness because those stories are just so deeply ingrained in people. They become such a part of their identity, but there's really no place to tell them. You go to a dinner party and people just don't want to hear about your knee. They really don't want to hear about your knee for an hour, but it's the only thing you can think about because every time you move your leg, something hurts. And so this is writing about things or writing within a context of illness has become critical really for people to understand their stories. And a lot of this actually, I think, grew out of the HIV crisis of the 90s because suddenly people were writing stories of illness, stories of caregiving in a way that really hadn't happened in this country before that. HIV really kind of, I think, flipped a switch. The reason that we talk about that is because, for example, the flu in 1918 killed, I just don't remember, I think it was like 600,000 Americans died in the flu epidemic in the second decade of the last century. But you really find almost nothing written about it. You'd think that there'd be this incredible outpouring of work, but there's, I've read books that were written that era and there's no mention of it. So part of the explanation I've heard, which I don't know if it's true or not, is that just wasn't part of the cultural milieu at the time. But once HIV came along, suddenly that writing instinct seemed to have been released. And I think it's continued. And I really believe that as a result, a lot of illness stories, caregiver stories, and I have to admit that some amazing bad doctor stories have been written by patients and caregivers. And I think that has been unleashed, or at least it's become acceptable and useful and shared and appreciated in the last 20, 30 years. But
Well,
that's what I like reading it and I've enjoyed editing it as well.
yeah, I think that's a great summary of things that one specific residency or medical school and then a broader understanding and trying to incorporate that and the humanity of people. They're more than just that. There's always a backstory.
Right.
What impact does that have on patients? What does the research show of when that a patient is able to share their story?
Sure. I can tell you some personal experiences of my own as a storyteller that I am. I remember when we were in training, and I trained a bit before you did, but there was this thing that we called the syndrome of the little paper, the petit papier, where people would come in and they'd have everything all written out carefully. And actually, we kind of made fun of that because it was like, these people are so focused on their illness, they're writing everything down. But to me, that's actually really helpful now. People come in, they've got stuff laid out. They can tell you a narrative of what's happened. They can tell you how it affects them and how it affects their relationships. And to me, that's been useful. And I've actually had patients who are aware that I've done writing, and I've been writing for years, blogging and other kinds of essays and things. And I've had people bring me their manuscripts. I've had patients come in and say, or they've said, I've written this story, or would you mind looking at this? Or it seemed like a good way to explain to you what's been going on in my life. So I wrote it out. And that opened some doors that I think released the smoke into the air so we could actually see what was going on. We could understand the relationships better. So I think, to me, that's one of the things that allowing people and saying, so again, one more story, I guess, but when I see people, when I saw people in the office, instead of saying, where does it hurt or when did this start? You basically say, tell me your story. And then when they've told their story, you sit there and you're quiet, because a lot of times what the really important part of the story is, as you well know, comes out after there's a period of silence. And then at the end of the visit, the question is always, what else do I need to know? Or what else is going on that would be helpful for me to know? And those are kinds of questions we really weren't taught when we were in medical school to ask. We were, you have, particularly now with the electronic medical record with pull downs, this 44-year-old man has had a sore left ankle for 3 weeks after a fall or something like that. And that's just, it's so limiting. And, the studies show that people come in the office to talk to the doctor, and the doctor interrupts within 12 seconds routinely. Even doctors who have had training in communication skills interrupt way too soon, and they never let the patient tell a story. So starting with, tell me your story, and finishing with, what else do I need to know, has allowed me, I hope, to understand what issues patients come in. The worst thing that I would say is if a patient comes in and goes home and says, I never really got to talk about the thing that brought me to the doctor's office today, that's a failure. And it's an expensive failure, and it's a failure that means that you're going to have to do it all again at some point in the future because you never really solved the problem. So those are how stories, I think, incorporate into a clinical practice in a way that allows patients to tell their stories. It's always more interesting that way. It was my prevention of burnout in my career. But sharing stories and seeing a couple of people's manuscripts over the years, that was a lot of fun.
And I think it's so interesting to actually hear people's stories if you get a chance, and trying to balance in the visit. But I had a recent patient, and I had one of the earlier podcasts is, to actually write down your story, especially dealing with chronic fibromyalgia and overlapping conditions. And I had a patient who said to me recently, who brought in a 6-page story going back to childhood. And she had heard the podcast and said, "You're the first doctor I've ever got a chance to tell my story to, and who wanted to hear my story, was actually interested in hearing the story. And it's actually makes life a lot more interesting than just, as far as a doctor. You get a chance to hear a biography of people's lives, and everybody's got their own unique story. And as doctors, there's a lot of common themes, just like action adventure and different but it makes, I think, a lot more interesting for the doctor too, to get a chance to know somebody. Out of curiosity, and the question that I have is, I work in, internal medicine, pediatrics, chronic pain, and lifestyle medicine. How does a subspecialist ENT doctor, who is, in a sense, we talk on this podcast, and one of the problems in medicine is it gets so much into silos that somebody might hypothetically see somebody for TMJ, but doesn't recognize that this is a part of a bigger picture of stress or impact of social and other things. But how did you get into this as a kind of a subspecialist into the world of narrative medicine?
That's a great question. I had an administrative role at the medical school many years ago. I've been journaling for years. My favorite classes in college were history and English and things like that. Although I was a biology major, chemistry minor, all that stuff. To go to medicine, I had this administrative role, and every month there was a newsletter. Back in those days, newsletters were actually printed on a piece of paper, 8.5 by 11. They said, okay, you got this role. We need a director's column. It's 3.5 inches long. It sits on the front page right here. Every month you got to write something. And my experience with the director's columns tended to be, everything's great. We're doing fine. Everything's good. And we're so wonderful. So I said, well, let me just have some fun with this. I'd been collecting these stories over the years. So I started writing patient stories out. I didn't do it every month, but I did it for several of the first few columns. And I got so much great feedback. People said, that was a really interesting story. What happened to that guy? Or tell me more about that. And thanks so much for sharing that. I really liked it. Or tell a patient I've been thinking about them. And I thought, this is really interesting. People really seem to connect with that. And these were all like 300-word essays. They were not big deals, but they were noticed, and they were things that people paid attention to much more than a lot of the other stuff. So when my job ended with that administrative role, the hospital asked me to continue writing a blog, not because they loved my writing, but they wanted to drive traffic to the website. So I kept writing, and every week or two I would put something on the blog, and then it just kept growing. And I started, at that point, had enough confidence in my writing that I started submitting to doing it to JAMA, Peace on My Mind, things like that, and had a few essays published. And it grew to the point where I was thinking about publishing a book, a collection of them, But first I wanted to learn more about it. So Columbia, the people I talked about a few minutes ago, they have an online course in narrative medicine certificate program that takes about 3 years to complete. And I took that and I learned so much about the process, the sort of the nuts and bolts of writing, but also about qualitative research and the pedagogy of teaching narrative and things like that. So it was just a nice experience for me to dive a little bit deeper, learn more, and really build confidence in writing because in medicine we write a lot, right? But it's a progress note in the chart. The fact that we're not confident in our writing, and I wasn't confident in my writing any more than anybody else. The fact that I had these experiences in writing gave me enough confidence to eventually put a collection together and to continue writing and to start teaching it because there just wasn't anybody else to do it. And that's been really fun for me. So as my clinical career was ramping down and I was looking for things to keep me busy, the narrative piece came up, and I've done that. Most of the stuff I've done since I retired clinically has had to do either with writing or editing, and that's been just a delight for me. I've loved it. So instead of retiring from something, I was able to retire into something, which is good.
And you get the chance to not be on call as much and not have to, if you get older doing surgeries, kind of like Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers, eventually your arm gets sore and run down from throwing footballs and tying sutures and doing surgery. But you get a chance to still get connected with the younger generation of medical students and want to have that impact.
It keeps you young and makes you feel old at the same time. That's really fantastic.
Oh, yeah, that's exciting. What can you tell about the listeners about the book that you recently have got published?
Just happen to have a copy right here. So this is the book, Fullness of Uncertain Significance, Stories of Surgery, Clarity, and Grace. So it's about 60 essays. They're all short. It's the kind of thing that most of them are patient stories. Some of my stories of my life, family stories about my parents, and others that influenced me. And it's taken from the arc of when I was working as a nursing assistant in a hospital in the Chicago area, when I was in college, up through this was published a year and a half ago, so just before I retired, but it really does talk about the transition out of practice and into retirement. So they're funny. Many of them have some humor built in, but I think they all have at least a little bit of insight into what we do. I wanted people, particularly medical students or people outside of medicine, to understand that, what a surgeon does. It's one of those kind of mystery professions, and, surgeons on Grey's Anatomy or Scrubs that sort of have a certain way of behaving, and maybe we're not all quite like that. And I think I wanted to show a bit of what the life is like so people would potentially be intrigued in what we do. It was fun, and I've gotten some nice feedback from it. And another nice thing, I was able to work with a publisher in Waukesha. It's called 1016 Press. It's part of Orange Hat Publishing, right in downtown Waukesha, and they've been just a delight to work with. So it's been fun from start to finish, and I've enjoyed it. And I've enjoyed the chance to go talk about it. I've done some grand rounds at a few medical schools and places around just to talk about the book and done some readings.
If there's a listener out there, and there's probably many listeners like this who've never really gotten a chance to even consider writing down their story.
Yeah.
What kind of advice or guidance that you might give to somebody? And many people here, unfortunately, have had really sometimes many decades of struggle, and often are one of the, we call this an invisible illness in the world because many doctors don't even acknowledge it's a real thing. They may think it's all in their head. But what kind of advice, guidance for those people who are struggling?
Sure. So one thing that you said I think is really critical. It's been going on for a long time. And you give someone a piece of blank paper and a pencil and say, write your story. It's really hard. I mean, that's a really hard thing to do for many people. But if you take a piece of paper and someone gives you a prompt like, write about a good day, or write about a day when things change suddenly, and set a timer for 5 minutes and just start writing, and don't stop until the timer goes off. Sometimes that really helps because I think it allows people to work to a prompt, and it gives you a very confined start and stop. And that's a doable chunk of time and a doable experience. And I think a lot of times for me, those have been those kind of experiences when I was trying to write about something and I couldn't figure out where to start. By working with a prompt and just doing a short burst of writing, sometimes that's really got the creative juices started. And the reason that happens for me, and I think others have found this as well, is you start writing and, you think, "What am I gonna write about?" And then you just start writing, and by the time that 5 minutes is up, you actually are on a pretty good roll, and it's not ended up anywhere near where you thought it was going to, because your mind starts percolating and you've got this topic that you want to work on. You say, it reminds you of something else as you're writing, and then you keep going. And by the time you get to the end of that, you really have a nice start on something that might actually turn out to be really helpful. So it allows you some, and you write about, I always encourage when I'm working with students, I say, you write about what you saw and what you heard and what you smelled and what you felt, but you don't write about, and felt with your hand, but you don't write about your feelings. You don't do any reflection at that point. You just write strictly about the objective things that you see or hear or taste, things like that, things that are in front of you. You write those down. And then later on, if you're going to develop this thing, then you go back and kind of analyze it, because if you're like me, you spend all day thinking about why stuff happens or what's going on or trying to understand, but sometimes we don't pay close enough attention to what's actually, the moment in front of us. That's then the Buddhist ringing the bell and paying attention to exactly what they're seeing or what they're experiencing in that very moment. So that allows you that chance to sit still and live in that moment just for long enough that you can gather some of that and then go from there. So I guess if the listeners were going to start, that's what I would do. Get your computer screen or a blank piece of paper and a pencil and a timer, or set your watch and give yourself 5 minutes and write to a very specific prompt. And you can make up your own, or you go online and look for writing prompts. And there's lots of sites that'll provide that. But those are the ways to kind of get started with that process of writing. And maybe that'll turn into a longer narrative that will help to sort out exactly what's going on. Actually, it's a lot of fun. And I think I've learned a lot in the process of doing that.
And I think it's had a recent patient who, and unfortunately, in the chronic pain world, there's often people almost feel like they don't want to be heard. Like you said, somebody's at a gathering and they don't want to hear about your knee. Oh, you're hurting, you're in pain, you're sore. But who else are you going to talk to? Because that's often on your mind. But what is interesting, and often in the world of fibromyalgia and overlapping syndromes, is you may not realize as you're hitting that moment of time, the presence in the physician evaluating you is somebody who's really struggling, but may not know that behind that story used to be a very vibrant, very active person who had a very full life, who now, through a series of things, has gotten worn down and is only a shadow of what their dreams have, and often don't have a lot of that hope. But many doctors may be very nearsighted and not be able to see the backstory of your life and have that, and then even going beyond that. And I think that's often therapeutic for people if they can tell us, when it's in the beginning and going back to what was life like in childhood and other things. And now in the computer records, I had a patient of mine who, in addition to a questionnaire, sent it through the electronic medical record. And also I had him write a narrative. And he said, my story with this condition. And it was going back. And it was something that I'm like, oh, I didn't know you grew up in Tennessee. Oh, yeah. Well, my parents moved around and had different jobs. I'm like, I didn't know that would happen. And as doctors, as you probably know, those little pieces of information you'll never forget that patient. Because they shared something about you and you have nobody exactly like that patient who's lived that experience.
There's a national project at VA hospitals where medical students will go in and interview veterans while they're in the hospital and help them write their stories. And those stories become part of the medical record. I mean, to me, that's just a great idea, where somebody was impacted by their time in service, but that becomes, because it's part of your story, it should be part of your records. And I think that's, people help, the students help the veterans write their stories. They go over them, make sure that they're correct. And if it's okay with the veteran, they go in their record. And I think we should do that for everybody. I love your story because I think that is absolutely correct.
I just heard, and it might not be the same study in the world of narrative medicine, where they had doctors, might have been med students, who got a chance to listen to veterans' stories. And the veterans felt better because they got a chance to share their story. And there was lower rates of burnout in doctors. That's going to take 2 hours to complete. And we're going to maybe do a lymph node dissection, and we're going to have radiation, etc. I'm just curious, in that light, some pertinent color to that's Bob Johnson. He's a grandpa, and his wife is Barb, and they have 3 kids. He's a former such and such, and he loves to do this. Did you ever add that in your?
I love doing that kind of thing because I would say, see a patient and we talk about what's going on and say, well, we've been planning this trip to the Caribbean for years. And we're finally getting to go. And then I'd see them a year later. And the first question is, well, how was your trip to the Caribbean? And they're just absolutely blown away that I would remember it. Well, it's because I wrote it. I put it right here in your note. So I would remember next time when I saw you, because that was how I did my progress notes. They often had little things like that, something built in. And yeah, certainly. I have a friend who was a hospice physician for years, and he said he spent more time gathering the social history than he spent gathering the medical history. He wanted to know where people grew up, what kind of work they had, who their family was, their habits, and other kinds of things, because he said that's, as a hospice physician, that's where you make connections, because their whole job is to help people feel better no matter what. And he says, maybe he didn't do that so much when he was an intensivist. You didn't care quite as much. But once you moved into the hospice work, that was the focus of his care. And that's what he focused on, was the social history. So I love that. And I tried to do that when I could. Yeah, you got 7.5 minutes to see patients, and sometimes that can be a problem. But it's amazing how much you can learn if you just mostly pay attention and ask one or two good questions. Like I say, I always made a little bit of a note about it so that I'd know how to ask about it and start the next time.
You're getting to know somebody's background in social history. In one of the narrative medicine books written in the 1980s, talked about sometimes characterizing a patient. And I think a lot of times, in the world of chronic pain, we might say, oh, that's a hypochondriac, such and such. That's a non-compliant patient. And one of the stories they shared was that there was a lot of social obstacles that were going on, that if you would know that, you would have some empathy and compassion. And I always thought, and I started in med school in 1992, and before that I heard of things, my mom was a nurse, and you hear about medicine and you hear the word hypochondria, and I go, I don't know if I buy into that. I just don't think that's a real thing. I don't know what is real, but I always thought that there has to be some backstory, something we don't understand. And I think in that world of non-compliance, what are those things that are getting in the way? And if you don't take time to understand that, you might quickly say, oh, he had tongue surgery, he's non-compliant, he's still smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
Suddenly you're judging them and we won't have much empathy for him. What is the backstory? What are the other coexisting conditions and social, the biopsychosocial, spiritual way of looking at things?
Yeah.
Arthur Kleinman.
The soul of care. I mean, he tells a great story about going out to make a house call because this patient was being called non-compliant. She wasn't doing any of the stuff that they wanted. She wasn't adhering to a diet. Turns out she was a widow, lived on the 3rd floor of a building, couldn't get downstairs. Some kid would shop for her at the store, leave the stuff at the landing on the 1st floor. By the time she finally got down there, she may or may not have it anymore. And she was blocks from a bus to get to the hospital. But the doctors at the hospital thought she wasn't taking care of herself. It was her fault. And once Kleinman visited her and saw how her social situation was and all the things she needed, that's when the tide turned. And you're exactly right. The non-compliant patient became the patient with all of these barriers to care, all of the things that get in the way of thriving. So, like we call a patient a poor historian. But the problem is the historian is the one who is taking the history, not the one who's providing it. So the poor historian is actually the one sitting in the doctor's chair, not the one sitting in the patient's chair. I think that's another piece of the puzzle we need to talk about too. So,
yeah. And of course, you didn't intentionally shame, but the resident maybe, or the intern maybe head down like, oh, wow, how did you figure that out? And I was supposed to have an hour with them, and you were able to help get some insights. But then, of course, they were able to carry that hopefully forward and learn those important.
Always fun to run across some little fact about the patient that opened things up. One of the stories I wrote about in the book was a patient that came in with his daughter's early dementia, very disengaged in the conversation, not knowing how to take care of him. Turns out, after talking to him, that he had been a state horseshoe champion in his 20s. He's in his 70s or early 80s now. And I got him talking about horseshoes, and suddenly he lit up. He was animated. He got out of the chair to show me how you hold a horseshoe when you're in competition and how many ringers he'd had in a row and things like that. And suddenly, just this one little fact that we were able to almost accidentally tease out of the situation allowed us to engage in a conversation that I never would have had otherwise. And his daughters, they'd heard most of the stuff, I'm sure 100 times, but just you don't think that you're going to go to a cancer surgeon's office and talk about horseshoes. But to me, that was the secret sauce that made that conversation worthwhile and allowed us to develop a relationship and a trust that allowed us to move on to the next place. And I learned a lot about horseshoes, so that was good too.
And now you still remember that story quite vividly. Of course, it's in the book, but you go, well, I never knew much about horseshoes. And
Yep.
as a doctor, I get a chance to learn over the years about a lot of things that I've never done myself, probably will never do in my life. But it actually is kind of interesting. And every day, it's like I honestly say, I almost always learn something new that is just very interesting, getting into little facts like how to hold a horseshoe and the right way to do things. And I think getting a chance to read your book would be, I think, very welcome. I think when I have patients who share their stories and I get a chance to share their stories on the podcast, I think it's nice to hear that other people are going through it. In the book I wrote, I blend information along with narratives, brief narratives of people. And I've had patients get back to me in feedback and say, I just cried the first 4 chapters
Hmm.
because you were somebody who obviously validates that this is a real thing. You're sharing this story as not, oh, look at this person. They just are hypochondriac and look at all these made up wild stories of their deluded brain. But no, this is somebody who actually gets it, who buys in that this is a real thing, and to feel that often for the first time that their story is important, what they're going through is important. And I look back at the stories of what many doctors were writing those narratives down. They didn't have all of these x-rays and tests going back to the 1800s and early 1900s. But what they did is they really believed the patients. They had theories that,
Mm-hmm.
quite honestly, were insightful and very close to it, but we didn't have the modern technology of things like the functional MRI to show that the brain processes pain in the spinal cord, and these are actually real. They called it neurasthenia, which meant nerve exhaustion, and they knew there was something, but of course, their understanding on how they described it was exactly how people are experiencing now. But you never made a diagnosis of that because after the 1920s, when we started wanting to get real organic illnesses, that fell out of favor. And yet 100 years later, now we're having a greater understanding. But when you look back at those stories, they are the same kind of stories I'm hearing now from
Yeah.
patients, and it's so interesting.
No, that's fascinating. Yeah. Well, and it goes so fast. The doctors who graduated from medical school in the mid 1930s were as far older than I am than the students graduating now. That to me is like, it's simple math. But on the other hand, I don't honestly know if I met a doctor graduated in the 1930s. I probably did, but they would have seemed like a billion years old when I was in training. So how much has happened? I mean, the doctors who graduated in the 30s didn't even have antibiotics. The first antibiotics came into use in the late 30s. And look what we've got now. And just imagine what the next generation, I can't even begin to think what the next generation of physicians will have as tools as long as they learn how to use them correctly. And I think this narrative thread that Kleinman talked about, he graduated in the 60s, and Thomas and Osler, and just, it goes way back. And that's, I think, maybe one of the threads that will carry through, hopefully, between the doctors of old and the doctors way far in the future.
And I think it's so important for illnesses that are most benefited by that holistic biopsychosocial model, that there isn't one medical quick solution. And I think in medicine, we love that solution that can fix somebody and be done with it. I think that in primary care, a lot of people may switch from primary care and just be urgent care doctors. There's one problem, you're here for that. Do I have strep throat? Don't I? Do I have a urinary tract infection? But these more chronic problems, where do they go? They're often left in no man's land, and that narrative medicine
That's
is.
why I went into surgery.
Oh, and I recognize that. I think that those are things like there's this other part, but that's why I thought it was fascinating that you had an interest in this, because I think people selectively realize like, oh, that other stuff is so messy.
Yeah. It's learning to tolerate ambiguity, I guess. That's one of the things that I learned a long time ago is that the students who don't tolerate ambiguity well tend to end up in surgical fields, as opposed to students who are good at ambiguity tend to end up in psychiatry or primary care. There's obviously some overlap, but
Well, and I think no matter where you're at, recognizing the importance, as you did that with your residents and sharing that narrative, and you continued to have that interest. As we get towards the end of the interview here, any last thoughts or stories that you'd like to share?
oh golly, you can edit out my
Yeah, you can.
having and hunting.
Yeah.
What do I tell as my final story? When dealing with patients, I have not had the privilege of working with people with chronic illness, strictly working with their chronic illness. But a lot of my patients, the reason I liked ENT was, you do kind of do quick fixes. You see a kid with the ear problems, you put in tubes and they're fine, and you take out their tonsils, they're fine. But actually, my interest going into training was I liked long-term care. I like taking care of the same group of patients over a long period of time. That's why I went into the cancer aspect of ENT. And there were patients that I saw as a resident. There's one guy I saw as a resident back in the early mid 80s that I continued to see even as I was getting close to retirement. And he had a series of cancers. It was just one of the probably genetic, certainly not lifestyle. He took good care of himself, but just had at least 3 cancers that I cared for over the years. And that to me was really a fascinating experience and a very rewarding experience. And so I guess when I'm talking to medical students, I try to talk about patients like that because I think, again, it's hearing that story and understanding the long term to me was the interesting part. To them, it's sometimes, at least off the top of their head, they're going to say, that would be hard because every time you see them, something terrible is going on and you've got another problem to fix. And to me, it's like, you're not fixing a problem, you're helping a friend. That's the beauty of the narrative piece is to flip that switch. I'm cautious with the boundaries that we need to establish with patients and physicians. I know they're really not my friends, but on the other hand, I do care about them. And many of the patients I cared for a long time and their families. And to me, that was one of the big privileges of what I got to do. Be part of people's lives, really at some of those critical junctures that they experience, where they're getting a cancer diagnosis or they're making decisions about cancer treatment or they're recovering from a big cancer procedure. And that was the privilege I was given in the route that I chose to go into medicine. And the fact that I hear their stories and then got the opportunity with their permission to tell some of the stories was just a bonus for me. So I guess that would be the bottom line is that it's really about the story. It always has been. And if we can get people in medicine to appreciate that again, I think everyone will benefit.
One last thought. In the title of your book, you use the word grace. And what are the sources of your inspiration for having compassion, for caring for others?
Well, good question. That comes really specifically from a friend of mine who was a pastor who very early in my career was talking about wanted to ask me about the difference between curing someone and healing someone. And it's not something I'd really thought about much before, but I think that was the point maybe that flipped a switch for me to realize that I've had patients that I've been able to cure, but they really weren't healed. And I've had other patients that I healed, but they weren't cured. And I think that being allowed to be in those spaces is a moment of grace in my life, is to when people allow me without the experience of long-term relationships to be at that level of intimacy is a moment of grace. And that's, I think, one of the things that I've enjoyed most and been in awe of and been most inspired by in caring for patients over the years.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom over the years and also for all the help and continued help with helping teach the next generation of doctors, and also for the listeners out there who are struggling to get a chance to consider writing out their narrative. I think it's therapeutic. Hopefully your doctor will be receptive. I do think that many doctors, if you have a chance to look through this and maybe talk about it at the next visit or ahead of time, if they can take a look at it, likely is going to potentially make that doctor's day or week, as it helps reduce their burnout and to understand them better. And also it's going to help you potentially improve your chance of healing as you share that story.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, that was great to have you on. And I think it's nice to share the information out there. It's one of the neat things about doing primary care is you get that longitudinal relationship kind of thing. And
Yeah.
I always thought it was kind of weird, continuity clinics, but we'll continue to get a chance to hopefully be involved in helping with the being around the residents and potentially medical students in touching. I was interviewed on another podcast, and the doctor said, you need to get on, do grand rounds or something on this in your local community. And I hope to be involved. I think it's inspiring to be around and wanting to share wisdom with others too, and to know other people out there are doing that. And I'm guessing at the workshop, is that kind of doing maybe a little bit more of sharing the importance and then some practical stuff on how to do that at the
Oh,
physician.
College of Physicians.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did one. It was a writing workshop, basically, and it's sort of one of these things where we read a piece together and then have a conversation, then give them a prompt and time to write. And then, they're welcome to read. They don't have to read, but if they're welcome to read or talk about the process afterwards. And I think that's the idea last time, was that Wisconsin chapter was sponsoring a essay contest.
Yeah. They're
So
doing
this
that
was,
again. Yeah.
okay, that was what this was for, was to try and spike the punch bowl, I guess, and help people start the process of writing. It's exactly like I was talking about with patients. If you give a blank piece of paper, it's impossible. But if you have a prompt and a limited amount of time, it's amazing what you can get down on paper, and that's the whole goal. So
Yeah,
we'll see.
I found when I looked through that, they had some prior ones listed, and one of the docs that I work with, been here 23 years, he had shared a story of him when he was in intern, resident, or med student, I think, or something. It was one of these things where a patient, he shared, these relatively brief, and he had in the story that was shared that he went in as he got the wrong patient. He presented and said, oh, this patient, Mr. Smith is such and such, but it was the wrong patient. They were in the wrong room.
Oh,
And then
great.
15 minutes later, there's a code being called, and that patient died.
Oh,
And
no.
and quote, made a mistake and really impacted him negatively.
Sure.
And yet, as we with a mature view can say, actually it wouldn't have made a difference if we were there 15 minutes earlier. You didn't quote kill the patient, but it was just a narrative. It was obviously storytelling and therapeutic, obviously, for him to share that, and likely
Yeah.
therapeutic, I think, for others to know that, oh, many other doctors probably had something like that happen in their training.
Yeah. I mean, there's more and more places where doctors can tell stories. There's a podcast called The Nocturnist, which is UC San Francisco. They have a lot of physician stories. There's a Examine Life conference at University of Iowa every October. People come and tell their stories or do workshops on storytelling and other things related to medicine and health. It's both patients and caregivers that interface there. We're doing a Med Moth story. It's a storytelling experience where people can get up and talk for 5 minutes on various topics. And so we have this storytelling event we're doing with the students and faculty in 2 weeks. We do it twice a year at MCW. We didn't do this kind of stuff when I was in medical school, so it's just been a lot of fun to watch them happen because it's a new world. So it's good.